So, hey, my name is Chris and I make weird videos on the internet. Guess what? And I talk about sometimes pretty deep philosophical stuff, mostly inspired by systems theory, but not always. But the last video that I did was about the categories of values, and we had extrinsic values and we had intrinsic values. So the extrinsic values, there's instrumental values, and there's inherent values. These are all both extrinsic values, right? And then intrinsic values. And I just made a noun out of it and talked about intrinsity and extrinsity, that which is the outer form and that which has no outer form but is constituting the outer form. But when I say constituting the outer form, that's already a premise, right? And I just wanted to talk about that premise, because if you talk about the inner and the outer, it's a different relationship than with the intrinsic and the extrinsic. Because when we talk about the difference of inside and outside, we can realize that each side is the necessary precondition of the other side. So what does that mean? There's no inside without an outside, and there's no outside without an inside, right? They define each other. Outside is what is not inside, and inside is, per definition, that what is not outside. Right? And if everything would be outside, there would be no inside. And without the differentiation from the inside, the entire concept of the outside would be completely meaningless. So they need each other. The inside cannot be without the outside. The outside cannot be without the inside. They are mutually presupposing each other. The inside is the necessary precondition for the outside, and the outside is the necessary precondition for the inside. They need each other. They are defining themselves with each other. Outside is what is not inside, and inside is what is not outside. So you have this pair, this couple, basically. And the connection between these sides is that one is the necessary precondition of the other. In other words, you can't have one without the other, right? But they are both necessary preconditions to each other, both ways, okay? And that is different when we talk about intrinsity and extrinsity, when we talk about medium and form, when we talk about transcendence and immanence, when we talk about the environment of the system and the system. So there are special differences, right? And they are kind of normal differences. Actually, there are three categories of differences. Very contingent differences. You can make a difference between everything. You can say the Buddha statue and then you could say the bird, right? They have nothing to do with each other. They're not opposites to each other, right? So you can make all sorts of distinctions. Totally contingent, right? The Buddha statue and the bird, or the dog and the book, have nothing to do with each other, are not contradicting each other, are not opposite to each other, just random differentiation. Contingent observation, random differentiation. That's the first category. Very boring. Nobody cares about that. Second category of differences is like the inner and the outer, right? The inside and the outside. These are not just random. Both sides of these differences, they're not just random, like the book and the Buddha statue, right? No, they are opposite to each other. So the inner is the opposite of the outer, and the outer is the opposite of the inner. Right or wrong would be another pair like that, right? There are differences that are opposite on both sides of the difference that are mutually presupposing each other. So one is the necessary precondition of the other, and the other is the necessary precondition of the one, right? No inner without the outer, no outer without the inner. Both ways. And then there are special differences. So let's talk about this third category of differences, right? So you have differences, and both sides are opposites, but they are not mutually presupposing each other. But there's a one-sidedness to them. There's a one-sidedness to them, and there's, in systems theory terms, it's called the unity of the difference. There's a one-sided difference because one side of the difference is actually not accessible. We're getting there. So it has a unity of the difference. Death and life would be such a difference. But I would rather talk about systems theory differences like medium and form. And the most important, you could also say the intrinsity and the extrinsity, not the inner and the outer, but the intrinsic and the extrinsic, right? And the most important and the most obvious, where I can show you or explain to you this very special uniqueness of these special differences, right? Is that between transcendence and immanence. So transcendence is basically when you want to conceptualize it in terms of religion or spirituality, you could say God and the world, right? Or Brahman and the world. Transcendence and immanence. Immanence is everything that has a form, everything that is, right? Transcendence is pure potentiality. Transcendence has no form. It is pure medium, right? Think of the sandberg is it sandcastle, I guess. So you're at the beach, right? There's sand. That's your medium. But the medium, sand, has always a form. It can only appear in a form. Whatever you do with the sand, it always has a form. So you can change the form, but the medium stays the same. It's always sand. You can build, I don't know, a cake out of sand. You can build cookies out of sand. I don't know. You can build a pyramid out of sand. You can build a castle out of sand, right? The castle, the pyramid, the cookie, or the, I don't know, whatever you build out of sand. That's the form, right? But the sand itself is the medium, so to speak. So it's kind of not a good example because sand itself is a form, of course, and so it kind of is not a perfect perfect example for what I'm talking about. What I'm really talking about is Brahman and the world. You know, I avoid the word God because it has been abused so horribly that I don't even want to use it anymore. But Brahman and the world, right? The divine and the divine principle, so to speak, and the world, so to speak, right? Brahman and the world, transcendence and immanence. And if you don't know what transcendence and immanence are, that video is not for you. Then you have to Google it because I'm not going back there. So you have to, this is for the people who watched the first video that I did and want to know how I came up with, or how I don't know, Transcendental Ethics came up with me, probably more than I came up with it. But here we are. So the core idea of this transcendental ethics, why I said that the intrinsity, the intrinsic, is always the necessary precondition of the extrinsic, and therefore it is the extrinsic is always an emanation of the intrinsic. The intrinsic, in other words, is constituting the extrinsic. Careful, careful, careful. Don't make the same mistake that I make. If you use the inner and the outer, you have a mutual connection, right? A mutual relationship, so to speak. The inner is the necessary precondition of the outer, and the outer is the necessary precondition of the inner. Opposites, but both sides are presupposing each other. That's the second category, not the completely random contingent distinctions or differences, like the dog and the book. We don't care about that. We care about interesting differences, at least the ones with opposites on each side, the inner and the outer, but the inner and the outer presupposing each other. Too boring for us. We are going for the third category of differences. And the third category of differences is a difference where there's one-sidedness, where we are kind of locked into a system or locked into the system. As long as we are human beings, as long as we are incarnated, as long as we are alive, as long as we are entertaining this existence, right? So we cannot, we kind of can, but not through the intellect alone, look on the other side, transcend this one-sidedness of these differences, right? Of these dualities, right? These are dualities. The special thing about these differences, they're opposite to each other on each side of the difference, and they are one-sided, so we can only really access one side, or we always, no matter where we're going, no matter what route we are taking, we're always coming back to that one side. So in that sense, they are one-sided differences, one-sided dualities, and we can transcend this one-sided duality. But first we have to understand the unity of the difference, why we always circle back to that one side, even if we talk about the other side. So, transcendence, immanence. Everything that I say is meaningful, has a form, and is immanent, right? Even when I talk about transcendence. When I talk about transcendence, for example, that talk about transcendence is an immanent form, right? So even if I talk about God, even if I talk about Brahman, even if I talk about transcendence, even if I talk about the medium, even if I talk about potentiality, the way I do it is immanence, is world, is form, is actuality, right? And this is very crucial to understand this, and you can't really understand that purely intellectual. I don't think it is possible to crack that nut purely intellectual. That's why we are transcending the one-sided duality. So the transcendence of the one-sided duality and the immanence of the unity of its difference. That's what I called it in my thesis. Why not, right? You know, but it has actually meaning. It has truthfulness, at least, to it, and I think it is describing a very important truth. And yeah, so I'm just reading this. In systems theory, there's a concept called the unity of the difference, that there are differences with one transcendent side, one side that is not accessible. So when we talk about transcendence, we can only do that through immanent forms. When I talk about transcendence, that talk about transcendence is immanent, right? So we can talk about the formless, but we can only do this in forms of meaning. Yeah, we can talk about the formless, but our talk about the formless is in itself a form. So the unity of the difference of transcendence and immanence is immanence. Because we as human beings are kind of locked into the system. We are alive, right? We are the world. Brahman, the world, that's what Sri Ramana Maharshi said, and I just love it because it's basically that. It's all that. The entire thesis is an expression of this one sentence. The world is illusory. And what is the world? The world is form. The world is immanence. The world is actuality. The world is system. All that is illusory. That's what he says. The world is illusory. That's his line. Brahman alone is real. Brahman, that's the transcendent. That's the medium. That's the formless. That's potentiality. That is all that which has no form, but is the potential of everything that is, without being something. Brahman is the transcendent God, right? So the world is illusory, Brahman alone is real, but then he says Brahman is the world. Brahman is the world. Brahman constitutes the world. Brahman emanates the world, right? It's not that the world, there are people who see it like that, but that's not what I do, right? That which is formless, that which is the medium, that which is Brahman, if you like, that which is the intrinsic, that which is potentiality, is constituting immanence, is constituting actuality, is constituting form, is constituting the system. In systems theory, it's the environment of the system, that which is not a system, so to speak, and a system. There are people who understand the environment of the system differently, but I understand it in this transcendence, immanence kind of form, just like I understand the intrinsic and the extrinsic. The unity of the difference, why? Because we can't access the other side. Not within forms of meaning, within forms of Sinn. There's the German word Sinn. There's a whole chapter, big chapter. The word Sinn is, you can talk like forever about the word Sinn, but it is basically the medium in which the system, at least the system Luhmann and Fuchs talking about, these are operating in, right? So you can't transcend the one-sided duality. One-sided duality. What is the one-sided duality? The one-sided duality are these dualities where there's a unity of the difference, As I said, the unity of the difference between transcendence and immanence is immanence. Why? Because it's one-sided. We can only be locked into immanence as human beings, right? Yet the transcendent, that part of the difference that is not accessible through the mind alone, through consciousness, yes, but not through the intellect alone, not through binary thinking, that's for sure. That which is not accessible, as I said, transcendence, Brahman, if you like, God, if you like, be my guest, right? But I try to keep this out of my stuff because I want to keep it functional. And if it's functional, it's not religious and it's not immoral or moral or whatever, you know, charged with emotions and ideology and all that horrible stuff, usually makes things very, very difficult, right? So let's talk about functionality. Let's keep God out of this. I brought him in, I know. But let's rather talk about transcendence and immanence and all these jazz. So the unity of the difference of transcendence and immanence is immanence. Why? Because one-sided, namely transcendence, is inaccessible. That's why it's a one-sided duality or one-sided difference. And the unity, of course, is the immanent part, because everything we talk about transcendence is a form of immanence. And you can say this with medium and form. The unity of the difference between medium and form is form. Why? Because the medium is formless, and whatever we talk about, whatever we conceptualize, whatever we think about, whatever the psychosocial condition co-production of the system is observing or communicating, is in form and therefore immanent form. And even if we talk about even if there is communication or observation about the medium or transcendence for that matter, that is always immanent form. There's your unity of the difference. There's the one-sided duality, right? So the real transcendence, the real medium, the real formless is not accessible within the system. True thinking or true means of, I should say, within the medium of Sinn. And Sinn is kind of translatable in this context as meaning. So, intrinsity as the necessary precondition of every form of extrinsity. We can say this sentence with all the other differences that we've talked about, all these special one-sided unity of the differences. So the medium is the necessary precondition for every form. When you build a sand castle, you need the sand, right? Even if you can build a sand cake or sand castle, but you need the sand. That's the medium, so to speak. So the medium, you don't need the form, you don't need the castle for the sand, but you need the sand for the castle, right? You need the inner for the outer, and you need the outer for the inner, because otherwise they will make no sense. But if you have a sand castle, the sand is the medium. You know, the medium doesn't care what you form out of it. It's always there. It always presupposes whatever you form with the sand. And in the same sense, the medium is necessary precondition of every form. The transcendent is necessary precondition of every form of immanence. The potentiality is necessary precondition of every form of actuality. And the environment of the system, in the sense of that which is not system, is necessary precondition of every form of the system. Which is pretty established, right? If in systems theory, that's not even a question anymore. But I'm just worried if I just read the script or just give you the script or the text of the script, it will be so dry. I don't know if anybody would ever watch this video and have any chance of following what I'm saying. So, yeah. Constitution. So the non-accessible side of these special differences, where there's one-sidedness and the unity of a difference, this inaccessible side is always necessary precondition of the accessible side, and the inaccessible side is always constituting the accessible side. So the medium is constituting the form, the transcendence is constituting the immanence, the intrinsity or the intrinsic is constituting the extrinsic. Again, intrinsic is and extrinsic is not in and out. That's a different category. But yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to say. The difference medium and form is one-sided, in the sense that one side is inaccessible because the medium is formless, and whatever we talk about or think about or conceptualize about that medium always has a form, necessarily has a form. Words, code, communication, observation, whatever you want to call it, it has a form. So even if you talk about the medium, that's not the real medium, right? You cannot talk, conceptualize, intellectualize, observe, communicate about certain things because they are just without language, without form. The medium, that which constitutes the form, is not conceptualizable within form, right? And that which is transcendent is not conceptualizable within that which is immanent. The intrinsic value I talked about, right? The intrinsic value, I mean, refers to intrinsity in the sense of the medium, transcendence, potentiality, right? Not in the sense of the inner, but in the sense of the medium, the transcendent, the formless, potentiality, or the environment, the Umwelt of the system, the environment of the system, which is conceptualized as that which is not system, but constitutes the system. In that sense, I refer to intrinsity, and in that sense, I refer to the intrinsic value. For those very special differences, those who are one-sided and have a unity of the difference, the transcendent, formless, medial or potential side is always necessary precondition of the opposite, which is immanence, which is form, which is actuality, right? Which is system itself. And I say it again because it's so important. The medium is the necessary precondition of all its forms. And the transcendent is necessary precondition of every form of immanence. Just like potentiality is the necessary precondition of every form of actuality. And in that line, intrinsity or the intrinsic is the necessary precondition of every form of extrinsity or the extrinsic. So there is, and when I say the inner and the outer mutually presupposing each other, right? Not the case by these one-sided unity of the differences, right, that we talked about. But there is a backcoupling or feedback effect in the opposite direction, you know. So the medium is constituting the form, the transcendence is constituting the immanence. But there is a backcoupling effect, feedback effect, right? Whenever actuality becomes potentiality, whenever what is immanent becomes transcendent, and whenever the form dissolves or rejoins the medium, then something is added to infinity. But you can't say that the outer or the extrinsic or the immanence is constituting, you know, the other side. That's not the case. It's kind of informing the other side. It's adding something to infinity, you know. But, you know, the way I see it, the divine principle, we don't need to go there. We can do this perfectly functional without, but for me it is kind of, but it doesn't need to be, right? If we just keep it very functional, we talk about transcendence and immanence. If you are bold enough to call it Brahman and the world, let's do that, right? So for me, the divine is constituting the forms, its forms, right? Immanent forms. The world, Brahman, is constituting the world, so to speak. The world in that regard is illusory, right? Brahman alone is real, and Brahman is the world. I say that again. The world is illusory, Brahman alone is real, and Brahman is the world. So there is a feedback loop whenever we die, whenever actuality becomes potentiality, whenever the immanent rejoins the transcendent, whenever the form dissolves and rejoins the medium, then something is added to infinity. But this adding to infinity is like, God is showing himself into the world and learning a few new tricks, and then he comes back and sees what he has learned, right? And what he can add to infinity. That's where human conceptualization reaches its limit, I guess. So we're pretty much dancing very close to kind of spirituality, kind of, for me, it's not a belief system. For me, it's logical. But to make that, you can say, if I talk about the unity of the difference, the critics will say, well, there is no transcendence. What are you saying? Transcendence is not even real. You just said it, That's what the critics say, right? They say there is no God. There is no transcendence that is constituting immanence. You said it yourself. If you talk about transcendence, that's a form of immanence. So there is only immanence. All you talk about the opposite, that's nonsense. Right? You can't even prove that, right? That's nonsense. There is no God. There is no Brahman. There is no transcendence, there is no medium, there is no formless, there is no potentiality. Maybe there's potentiality because that's, you kind of can conceptualize that with a less ambitious mindset, right? But everything else is just, for some people it's woo-woo, right? They don't want to know anything about Brahman. They don't want to know anything about intrinsity or the intrinsic that is constituting the extrinsic. They don't want to know about transcendence. They say, you said it yourself, every talk about transcendence is immanence. That's true. That's why it's the unity of the difference. That's what I say to these critics. But that's the point where I say within the medium of sin, within the medium of meaning, so to speak, within the medium, of sin. God, that word. I'm not going in this, but that's the medium of the system. So the system is basically observation and communication. So there's a code to the system in systems theory, according to Luhmann. There's a code to it, right? And as long as you operate within that code, you cannot reach the other side. Immanence, Brahman, the medium, the formless, potentiality. These sides are just not accessible because every talk about it is its opposite, is immanence, is form, is... I think I'm repeating myself, but repetition is important because otherwise there's no chance of, I don't know, maybe it is clear. Maybe you just, by the way, send me a comment if you think, yeah, well, this is obviously, right? I always thought about that. So please do so. And if you think, oh, what the hell is he talking about? Let me know too. So as long as we're operating within the system, it can only be one-sided, and it is not accessible within the system. That which constitutes the system is not accessible within the system, yet it is the necessary precondition of the system itself. Wow. As I said, you can't access the inaccessible side of these special differences. You can't, not within the system of sin, right? Within the medium of sin. So that's why I always say you have to meditate, because then you can only experience transcendence. You can only experience the medium. You can only experience potentiality. By the way, I think humanity is going through that experience of potentiality. I made a video about that too. We're experiencing things that go beyond the intellectual, conceptualizable framework that we're usually operating in. And that is necessary to make that, when I talk about, when I say transcendence of the one-sided duality, that's exactly what I mean. But you can't transcend the one-sided duality, these dualities who have the unity of a difference, with anything that is operating within the system itself. So you have to experience it. And the way to go to experience that, this is the moment I can say, talk about systems theory. I can talk about Hegel. I can talk about what else we got? You could put Husserl in there, and you could cybernetics in there, and all that jazz. And you can read a ton of books. Please do so if you wish to. But there is always that moment when you have to jump, when you have to leave the conceptual mind behind and make a jump, make an experience. And without that experience, that thesis that I wrote makes no sense. If you haven't experienced it, then you will always say, look, buddy, you just said it yourself. Transcendence, immanence, the unity of the difference is immanence. So even if we talk about transcendence, there's no real transcendence. It's made up bullshit. No, sorry. But, that's the argument of those who have not transcended the one-sided duality. And when I say transcendence of the one-sided duality, it is an experience. And if you haven't made it, you can't understand it. Because only if you experience the transcendent, only if you experienced the medium, potentiality, and we're kind of going there right now as a whole, as a collective, as a community, as humanity, we're experiencing a lot of potentiality right now, which is a beginning, right? To be confronted with that which is not conceptualizable within the system. So you have to make that jump. Then you're not just talking about the transcendent in an immanent form, but then the talk about the transcendent becomes truly transcendental, right? Transcendent is when you actually be there, experience. If you experience the transcendent, you're experiencing it, right? You're not going to miss this. And if you talk about the transcendence, then you're on the side of immanence, and you're locked into the system. You're always immanent, no matter what form you use. Even if you talk about the transcendent, that is not the transcendent, that is immanence. Transcendence is only experienceable. Is that a word? You can only experience the transcendent. You can't conceptualize the transcendent within the system of meaning or sin. But if you have experienced the transcendent, then your observations that you do afterwards within the system are truly transcendental. The difference between the words transcendent and transcendental, very important. Transcendental is when you've seen the transcendent and you begin to talk about it, but not because you just conceptualize it, but you have actually experienced it and then you talk about it. That's transcendental. Transcendental. In that regard, it is a transcendental ethics. And then we come back to the values. So if you observe an instrumental value is an end. The end presupposes that which is called accidents, could be the instrumental means. Accidents is whatever you project onto substance, right? So it's not inherent to substance itself, it is projected onto it. Like the means to an end, you know, a cow is not means to an end. A cow is just a cow, right? The means to an end is an intellectual concept that you project onto it. So if you observe an instrumental value, that's the end. The end presupposes the means, which is a form of instrumentality, which is a form of accidents. And that presupposes, the accidents presupposes that which is projected onto, presupposes that onto, namely the substance, right? Substance can be observed or valued as inherence. Inherence is a form of extrinsity. It has a form, right? And the extrinsity is constituted by intrinsity. And in this regard, every instrumental value presupposes an inherent value, and that inherent value presupposes an intrinsic value. Why? Because accidents presupposes substance, substance, which is a form of inherence, which is a form of extrinsity, which is constituted by intrinsity. Every instrumental value presupposes an inherent value that presupposes an intrinsic value. Why? Because I say, if you value something, you subsequently have to also value all of its necessary preconditions. This is, and I'm not going to explain this in this video, the law of the upward spiral. There's a downward spiral too, but I'm not making the argument for the downward spiral. I'm making the argument for the upward spiral. If you value something, you subsequently have to also value all of its necessary preconditions. That is the law of the upward spiral. Under any other conditions, the system could not be sustainable or even flourish. It would, on the other hand, have a destructive spin, that's the downward spiral, instead of the constructive spin of the upward spiral. The upward spiral is all about transcendence and integration, right? We negate, we differentiate, we transcend, we integrate. That's the upward spiral. Downward spiral is all about differentiation and pure negation. Not on this channel. So, the world is illusory, Brahman alone is real, Brahman is the world, Sri Ramana or Maharshi. But in this direction, there's a spin to it, there's a directionality to it. The world is illusory, right. Brahman alone is real, right, but Brahman is the world. Brahman constitutes the world. The transcendence constituting the immanence, the intrinsic constituting the extrinsic, potentiality constituting actuality, the medium is constituting the form. What else do we got? The environment of the system, that which is not system, is constituting the system itself. And I say it again, the world is illusory, Brahman alone is real, Brahman is the world. Now, Buddha, my friends.